Hi everyone, Mr Tobin here, and welcome to this video where we're going to analyse the poem Genetics by Sinéad Morrissey. I'm going to do some explanation first, and then we'll look at some of the really interesting things that we can say about the poem. On the surface, this poem by Sinéad Morrissey is quite a straightforward one about a speaker whose parents have separated in some way, but she's not particularly upset because when she looks at her hands, she sees that there is still a connection between them in herself. Quite literally, her genes, herself, is a mix of both of her parents, so in a way they are still together. At the end of the poem, she addresses someone else and suggests that the children they have together will also have a mix of their genetic material, and so the cycle will repeat itself. However, when we examine some of the language and particularly the structure, we see that perhaps there is something else going on, and that the speaker is not as okay with their parents' separation as they might like to think. Let's begin though by having a read through of the poem. My father's in my fingers, but my mother's in my palms. I lift them up and look at them with pleasure. I know my parents made me by my hands. They may have been repelled to separate lands, to separate hemispheres, may sleep with other lovers, but in me they touch where fingers link to palms. With nothing left of their togetherness but friends who quarry for their image by a river, at least I know their marriage by my hands. I shape a chapel where a steeple stands, and when I turn it over, my father's by my fingers, my mother's by my palms. Demure before a priest reciting psalms, my body is their marriage register. I reenact their wedding with my hands. So take me with you, take up the skin's demands for mirroring in bodies of the future. I'll bequeath my fingers if you bequeath your palms. We know our parents make us by our hands. So let's look at the poem stanza by stanza, but before we begin, I just want to make a note of some of the terminology I'm going to use. When I say speaker, I mean the person saying I in the poem. We know the poem is written by Sinéad Morrissey, the poet, but that doesn't mean that the I in the poem is actually her. It may not be about her life or her experience at all. Just like a songwriter or a story writer doesn't always write about themselves, a poet too can make up fictional events to get across an interesting idea. And also, we don't know whether the speaker is male or female. However, when I'm speaking, I'm going to refer to the speaker as her, as she, simply because the poet is female, and I find it easier to do that rather than constantly referring to they or them. Okay, stanza 1. My father's in my fingers, but my mother's in my palms. I lift them up and look at them with pleasure. I know my parents made me by my hands. Okay, so the first stanza, like all of them bar the last one, is 3 lines. We call that a tercet. And in it, the speaker begins by telling us that her father's in her fingers and that her mother's in her palms. Now this seems quite an odd thing to say, but here she's talking about resemblance. Her fingers are like her father's fingers, but her palms resemble her mother's. So in this first line, the speaker is setting out this idea that in her hands, there is a mix of both her parents. The title of the poem comes into play here as well. It's called Genetics, and we know that our genes make us who we are. We inherit different things from our parents, genetic material, that often dictates whether we are tall or short, or the colour of our hair, or even the colour of our eyes. So here, the speaker is talking about the genetic material given to her by her parents. Her fingers look like her father's, and her palms look like her mother's. In the second line, she says that she looks at her hands with pleasure, and this tells us that she's happy about this. It tells us that she has a good relationship with her parents, that she's glad that she has their features, even only in her hands. The third line, the last in the tercet, is interesting because it's a statement. The speaker here is sure. I know that the speaker's parents made them by her hands. Here we have an image of the speaker examining her 2 hands held up in front of her, and they are looking at them with pleasure and satisfaction. She knows who she is, and she knows who her parents are, and that her parents made her. She has a secure place in the world. Stanza 2. They may have been repelled to separate lands, to separate hemispheres, may sleep with other lovers, but in me they touch where fingers link to palms. The very first line of the next stanza seems to undermine that security. The speaker says that her parents have been repelled to separate lands, and not just separate lands, but separate hemispheres, different sides of the world. The use of the word repelled is interesting to me because it makes me think of magnets. When you put 2 magnets together that repel each other, they won't go together no matter how hard you try. And even if you get them to touch for a moment, they won't stay like that. This is an interesting way to describe the parents. Does it maybe suggest that their relationship was so bad that they repelled each other like magnets, that they could never be together? Even so, the speaker reassures herself that even though her parents are separated, they are touching metaphorically where her fingers meet her palms. Stanza 3. With nothing left of their togetherness but friends who quarry for their image by a river, at least I know their marriage by my hands. There's 2 ways of interpreting this stanza. Either the only thing left after their breakup was the friends they made together when they were a couple, and these friends are searching for what they once knew of this couple, or it could be that now that they've separated, they are just friends. Either way, the second line tells us that either they or their friends search. Quarry means to dig, so they are digging or looking for their image by a river. We know that we may sometimes be able to see our reflection in a river, but that the image is unstable because it changes as the water flows and ripples. Perhaps this stanza is telling us that whoever is trying to find the image of the speaker's parents, whether it's themselves in their new role as just friends, or whether it's the friends they had when they were a couple, whoever it is, they're having difficulty because, like a reflection on flowing water, it's constantly shifting and changing. The last line in this tercet is repetitive of the last line of stanza 1, but for the words at least. This links back to the other lines in stanza 3 because the speaker is hinting that the image of her parents is unstable and shifting as they change, but at least there's something permanent in her own hands. It's a permanent record that they were married, they had a child, and that child is the speaker. Stanza 4. I shape a chapel where a steeple stands, and when I turn it over, my father's by my fingers, my mother's by my palms. This stanza brings to mind the children's game where you interlock your fingers, you make a church steeple out of your two forefingers, and then you turn it around to show your other fingers, which represent the people in the church. There's some really nice assonance here as well. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds, A, E, I, O, and U, and we have that pleasing sound of the A and E sounds in shape a chapel where a steeple stands. It's also that childhood game, which is interesting because we get the sense that the speaker is grown up. Indeed, in the last stanza, they talk about having their own children, but in stanza 4, they become childlike with this game. The last line of this tercet repeats the earlier idea of the father being in the fingers and the mother in the palms. Stanza 5. Demure before priest reciting psalms, my body is their marriage register, I reenact their wedding with my hands. The word demure means shy or reserved, and this stanza continues the idea of the child pretending that their hands are a church. The speaker imagines their mother and father, young and shy, in front of the priest, reciting psalms, which are religious songs. The speaker reinforces this idea that although their marriage is over, it still exists in some way in the speaker. The speaker is the result of their marriage, proof that they were married even if they aren't anymore. The last line in this tercet is another interesting line. The speaker says, I reenact their wedding. There's two ways of looking at this. The speaker is saying that their wedding, their marriage, is visible in her hands because her hands have features of both parents. But it could also suggest that the speaker is unwilling to let things go, and she insists on reenacting the wedding. She's trying somehow to reverse history, to go back in time, because she's not as okay with this separation as perhaps she's letting on. Stanza 6. So take me with you, take up the skin's demands for mirroring in bodies of the future. I'll bequeath my fingers if you bequeath your palms. We know our parents make us by our hands. In this stanza, we realise that the speaker is addressing someone else. It's also the only quatrain, the only stanza with 4 lines. She says, so take me with you. Here the speaker is talking about having children with the person they are addressing. I'll bequeath my fingers if you bequeath your palms. Bequeath means to leave to someone else, to pass on, usually to leave something to someone in your family. Here, the speaker is saying that she will contribute her fingers if the other person contributes their hands, so that their child, just like the speaker, will have fingers resembling one parent and palms resembling the other. The last line is repetitive of previous lines in the poem with one crucial difference. Instead of it being singular possessive pronouns like I and my, it's collective, we, our and us. The speaker here is perhaps speaking to all of us when she says that all of us have parts of both of our parents and our genes, and that each of us, me, you, everyone, is proof of our own parents. We all know that our own parents made us by simply looking at our hands. So this poem seems to end on quite a positive note. The speaker is telling us that no matter what happens in relationships, no matter whether or not couples stay together, their children can be sure of their place in the world simply by knowing that their parents made them. To do this, we only have to look at our hands. And here, hands isn't necessarily hands for everyone. You might have your mother's nose or your father's ears, but there will be something that you can trace back, and that should give everyone comfort. It gives you solid grounding. You can be sure of your place in the world. However, the language and structure that Morrissey uses in this poem often undermine that idea of stability, and that's what we're going to look at now. There is language repeated throughout the poem, and that is primarily the image of the hands. Hands or palms feature in every stanza, and the interplay between those two words is also a point we can discuss. Palms and hands is a half rhyme. A full rhyme would be two words that match each other in sound perfectly, like thatch and match, or pride and slide. With two words like palms and hands, however, it is only a half or a close rhyme because of the A sound in the middle. This could suggest a number of things, perhaps that a child, although it has the same genetic material as their parents, is not a perfect copy, not a perfect replica. It could also suggest that not everything is right, not everything is sitting well with the speaker about this situation, the parent separation. Just like something is slightly off to our ear in the rhyme, something is off in the speaker's pretending that everything is okay. There's also the image of the shifting water and the unstable image on its surface. There seems almost something desperate in the speaker's attempts to find something solid to cling onto now that their parents' relationship has collapsed and that they are repelled to separate parts of the world. The final image to focus on here is that of the child's game with their hands making a steeple and reenacting the parents' wedding. There is something quite childlike, both in the game, obviously, but also in their attempts to reenact the wedding. Almost like the speaker can't accept that their parents are no longer together, and if they can't be together in real life, the speaker will reenact the wedding so they can be together in the speaker's mind at least. Structure. Now, this to me is the most important aspect of this poem. The poem is a villanelle. A villanelle is a 19-line poem that follows a very strict pattern. Have a look at the highlighted parts here. Now, in a traditional villanelle, the repeated lines are repeated word for word, but Morrissey repeats the ideas in them and some of the words. Look at the red lines, particularly the last few words of each line in red. The rules of the villanelle are as follows. The first line of the first tercet is repeated as the third line of the second and fourth tercets and as the third line of the quatrain. The third line of the first tercet is repeated as the third line of the third and fifth tercets and as the final line of the quatrain. This means then that 8 of the lines in the poem, exactly half, are used for repeating this central idea of the poem. The author, Philip K. Jason, in an article in this journal, says that the repetition in the villanelle means that it's often used to present obsessions. Here in this villanelle, perhaps the speaker's obsession is with their parents' relationship, and despite seeming to be fine with things, the constant repetition shows us that they're really not. Similarly, there's a suggestion at the end that maybe the speaker is afraid that their genetic material that they've inherited from their parents may end up with their own relationship ending. The language used is very clinical and doesn't suggest that the speaker is marrying or getting into a relationship with someone that is necessarily based on love. The speaker says that having children and continuing the genetic sequence is the skin's demands, not necessarily something that the speaker wants to do because of love for this other person. So to sum up, we've seen that there's 2 ways of looking at this poem. On the surface, it's a straightforward poem saying that despite the separation of the speaker's parents, the speaker is safe and secure in the knowledge that their relationship exists or is proven by her own genes. The speaker does not appear affected by their separation. They are still together when she looks at where her fingers touch her palms. The speaker then addresses her potential partner and asks them to contribute, with the speaker, to the genetic material of their own children. On the other hand, we've seen that the poem's structure, it's a villanelle, suggests the idea of obsession, that the speaker is obsessed with the separation of their parents and tries to keep them together by reenacting their wedding through childish games. This would lead us to believe that the speaker is not as secure or comfortable as they appear. There's a suggestion in the final stanza that the speaker is afraid that her relationship may go the same way as her parents, by the use of the phrase, the skin's demands. It appears to be not what the speaker themselves want, but some sort of biological requirement. And one final thing, you don't necessarily need to talk about this in an answer, but I think that it's really interesting. So the author Philip K. Jason, the one who said that villanelles are often used to write about obsession, well, he also wrote that sometimes the constant repetition in villanelles leads to a sense of dislocation, like when you say the same word over and over until it loses all meaning. Well, that word dislocation caught my attention because I was reading another article where Sinéad Morrissey was interviewed and she spoke about growing up in Northern Ireland. Morrissey's parents were members of the Irish Communist Party, and as such they were neither Catholic nor Protestant. And Morrissey said living in Belfast and not being Catholic or Protestant contributed to a sense of dislocation, of belonging to neither community. Now, as we said at the beginning, we can't assume that the speaker here is Morrissey, but perhaps there are some elements of personal experience at work here. The poet's own sense of dislocation being channeled into the speaker's sense of dislocation for entirely different reasons and enhanced by the villanelle structure. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you found this useful. Make sure to download the worksheet to go with this video, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, then please do. Make sure to like and leave a comment, and keep an eye out for more videos coming soon.